going to learn some basic watercolor techniques, how to get yourself set up to begin painting, and also how to think about and how to construct a painting, how to think about a painting in terms of layers, how to organize yourself as you complete a full painting. Okay, so I have my setup here. I have a palette. It's a little bit dirty. However, I have all my paints here. I have my areas where I am mixing my colors. I have two brushes that I'm using. I have one kind of larger brush, but it goes to a nice point. And then I have a clean dry brush that I'm going to use to soak up some extra paint or extra water, just in case I have something bleeding into a place where I don't want it to bleed. I have an extra brush here that I'm going to use kind of like a sponge. Okay, so I also, of course, have my paper towel, which is one of the most important tools that you can use in creating a watercolor painting. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is prepare my colors. I have, these is all tube watercolors, and they are mostly pretty dry. I've had these same watercolors, I use them a lot, and so I've had them actually for years, and they dry out, and then I just reconstitute them using some water. So I'm going to use some purple, and that, if you notice, is already really wet, and so that's all ready to go. I'm going to use some red. So I'm going to add some water to that red, and I'm going to dissolve some of that dried paint and create a lot of really nice wet watery paint. Enough that I can really soak my brush and saturate my brush, because I want to make sure that I'm using enough paint when I'm painting. Okay. My palette is a little bit, if you notice right here, it's a little dirty. So I'm going to actually, I have an old paper towel. I'm going to wet that just a little bit, and then I'm going to wipe off this area so I have a clean place to mix my colors and prepare my paints. Okay. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do, put this over here. First thing we're going to do is learn three basic techniques. We have wet on wet, we have washes, and we have graded washes. So the thing with watercolor is understanding how paint moves from place to place. Paint moves from wet area to wet area. So if you have an area where you really don't want the colors to flow together, and notice when I'm painting that I'm really making sure that I'm saturating my brush. I'm making sure that I have enough paint on that brush. I've taken some of the paint that was in the little well and I've put it on my palette. And so that I have, this is the paint that I'm going to be working with. Okay. So if I want an area to stay, that the paint to stay in a particular area, I'm going to make sure that I'm painting on a dry surface and that there's no wet paint around it. And so this paint will not flow anywhere, right? That's called wet on dry. That's where we have a dry surface and then we have the wet paint on top of the dry surface. Another technique is called wet on wet. That's when you start with a wet surface. So I'm taking some water and I'm just painting an area so that that paper is wet. And then I'm going to take some of my paint and then I'm going to just very lightly touch my brush on the wet surface, and you can see the paint starts to bleed. And that's what we call the wet on wet technique. And we can use that to also mix colors. So if I take a little bit of my red, I can very lightly touch some red onto that purple, and then I have kind of more of a red violet. Okay, and eventually those colors will just kind of bleed together, they'll mix. And then that's one way to mix colors. And so that is wet on wet.